Welcome to Balancing the Ledger, where tech and finance intersect. I'm Robert Hackett.
And I'm Jen Viechner.
And today we're here with Claire Hughes Johnson, the Chief Operating Officer of Stripe. Thanks for joining us, Claire.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So Stripe is the highest valued fintech unicorn in the US. And earlier this year, it raised a whole bunch of money. It's valued at $22.5 billion. What's going on at the company? How are you using that money? How are you growing? What's next for Stripe?
Feels like we're just really at the beginning. I know everyone says this, but we really are. Most of our energy right now is going into a couple areas. One is global expansion. I mean, we're now getting to sort of the harder markets to open. We've got private betas going in like India, Mexico, Brazil, and a lot of demand actually from users. Some of them there, actually a lot of them, because Latin American financial infrastructure is challenging, and then a lot of them from the US and Europe that want to do business there. So that's exciting. We're also building out what we think of as our core infrastructure for a payment platform. I think there's a misconception that Stripe is about just payment acceptance, but really we're about funds in and funds out. So instant payouts, or forms of payment like issuing virtual or actual credit cards to use for your marketplace business, and even point of sale acceptance. So it's like building out the network we think of as like treasury capabilities in the network, and then the capabilities you need on top of that, fraud control with our Radar product, a lot of payment optimization, so authorization optimization, making sure you can reduce your declines. We're working on a lot of interesting things on the dispute side. And I think the goal is that you have this payments and treasury network available in as many markets as we can get to around the world, where we're just managing all of your commerce flows for you, and there's software on top of that that's protecting you from fraud. And then also adding billing and subscription products and B2B products. So we're not sitting around. We are pretty busy building out the core infrastructure that any business, I hope, will use to process payments and pay in and pay out.
Can you give us a sense of how fast e-commerce is growing globally now and how fast Stripe is growing within that?
Well, e-commerce I think of as a more narrow category of like retail commerce. Maybe that's just my definition of it. So e-commerce I think is growing like 5% globally, and Stripe is growing more quickly than that. But in terms of online commerce, right, we were just looking at some statistics. I mean, there are even just B2B transactions, like billions of transactions a day, and even just currency exchange period on a daily basis is like over 5 trillion, right? So I think that we're looking at a secular shift to what you're getting at, and maybe anyone interested in fintech who's watching, of all commerce moving online. And that's been primarily enabled by mobile devices, but I think people would be surprised actually at how much B2B is still really like paper invoices, checks, like inefficient, ineffective manners of moving money. And so that's where our billing products are going to, I think, start to have a real impact.
One thing that stuck out to me in Jeff Bezos' annual letter to shareholders this year, he talked about how Amazon is still very small, which is kind of crazy to think about. But his point was that 90% of retail transactions still occur offline rather than online.
Right. No, we often cite less than 5% of commerce occurs online. And people say, but what about Amazon? And Jeff finally did our work for us and explained that it's true. It's amazing how little of it happens today online.
So you've just made an acquisition in Europe. Tell us a little bit about the strategy there.
Yeah, we acquired a company called Touchtech, and I think we really came to the acquisition because of some work we've been doing to prepare all of Stripe's users for SCA, or strong customer authentication regulations happening in Europe. There was a lot of work that many companies went through to comply with GDPR about a year ago. And there's a second part to that, which is the strong customer authentication, which is really meant to be a consumer protection and a fraud control, but effectively is when there's an internet transaction, having the purchaser authenticate that it is in fact them buying, often with a phone, right? So a text message and verifying, yes, that was me, which is understandably a good consumer protection, but creating a lot of friction.
That's going to slow things down for people.
For folks who study consumer behavior and shopping carts and things, it's really scary because it does create a lot of friction. It's also very challenging to comply with because it pauses your transaction and then you have to complete it, and you can't do so in real time, right? So there's an infrastructural element to it for payment implementation that's pretty rough. What our mission is to take away that complexity and cover all the compliance and the infrastructure you need for payment acceptance and paying out. Touchtech works on the issuer side. They're going to help. So if you think of it as a two-sided transaction where we're working with the merchant to make sure that acceptance flow, the issuers also have to play a role in this is a legitimate card, and as the person authenticates it. And we think that that's going to help reduce that friction that's being created by SCA. We're excited to integrate their technology with Stripe, but we have a lot already done as we need to because it's rolling out in September.
Well, all of these different countries that you're going into, they all have their own unique financial infrastructure, their own idiosyncrasies. So what challenges do you face in bringing your product to all these different places?
Yeah, well, do you have another 40 minutes? I think this is one of the biggest offerings that Stripe provides for our users, which is you don't have to do all the work on the market entry front. But it is work that we do, though. First of all, we partner with financial partners around the world to make sure that we're integrated in with their rails effectively as we need them. We direct integrate increasingly with the card networks, which gives us a chance to roll things out more quickly. But there's still a lot of banking partnerships. Then there's the regulatory side, which is working with local governments and understanding. There are quite a few governments around the world where their regulatory scheme hasn't contemplated online in as much detail as you would hope. And so some of what I hope we're doing for commerce generally and growing it around the world is partnering with governments and saying, okay, how do we apply this in a world that is changing pretty rapidly in terms of payments? And then obviously making sure we can take all the payment methods that are most in use in the country. And those payment methods all behave incredibly differently than, say, I think in the US we're pretty comfortable with credit cards, but there are a lot of markets around the world that have pretty unique and interesting payment methods, whether it's konbini in Japan or boletos in Brazil. You want that coverage if that's how consumers pay.
How many currencies do you support now?
We're over 130. Currencies is almost as easier actually than payment methods.
Why is that?
With a currency, you have foreign exchange, and you have the ability to say, okay, that was this many pesos, it's this many dollars. Whereas with a payment method, you are actually under the hood in the banking infrastructure. Some of these payment methods are about, say, accessing the customer's bank account in some cases. Well, you've got to have that connection to the banks, and there's permissions from the customer in cases where they behave. Boletos in Brazil is an installment payment method, so it's effectively a lending product that is a payment method. So there's a regulatory scheme around that, but there's really an infrastructure of how does that money need to move in order to satisfy the transaction. That is much more about engineering.
You mentioned foreign transaction is relatively less complex than the payment methods, but I know you used to, for a little bit, accept Bitcoin, and then you moved away from that because of some of the issues there. How are you thinking about cryptocurrency these days? Why is that more complicated than you want to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, we were the first provider to accept Bitcoin, actually, and we also went out with Alipay and WeChat Pay pretty early because we believe, look, there's a lot of new ways people are going to pay, and we want to be on the forefront of that for anyone using Stripe. The challenge with Bitcoin was really, well, there wasn't any demand for it from our merchants, first of all. And I think that the reasons are because it's not really acting like a currency. It's acting a little bit more like an asset. And how does that look? It looks like high transaction fees, like as high as $50 earlier this year. Really long close times for the transaction, so maybe an hour, whereas Visa does 24,000 a second. And a kind of volatility in actually the value of that currency. And if you have a long close time, and changing value, you're not sure you're actually getting the payment price that you ask for. And so we weren't getting demand. We weren't seeing it having very high usage. So we deprecated it. If things change there, we could bring it back. And as you know, we invested in Stellar. We're very interested in the space. But it's not where money's moving today. So I think I mentioned that there's like $5 trillion of currency exchange happening every day. In terms of Bitcoin, I think it's in the billions, which sounds like a lot, but it's not relative to where money is moving today. And as we also talked about, so little money is online even. We got to tackle that. We got to build the technology infrastructure, the agility layer for online acceptance and payout before we get to maybe, I hope, more modern methods. But I think we've got a few steps to go.
This is proving to be the year of the big tech IPO. We're seeing Uber, Lyft, Pinterest, WeWork just filed. When can we expect Stripe to go out?
We don't have any plans. We're not following that trend. It's exciting to see.
Do you think you'd raise another round or go public first?
I have no news on that, I'm afraid.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Claire.
Great, thank you both.
I'm Robert Hackett.
I'm Jen Viechner, and for more Balancing the Ledger, go to fortune.com.
See you next time.